Hi, my name is Joe Cernik, and I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University, and I'd like to welcome you to Insight. Now, Insight is the show where we normally discuss books on politics, both domestically and internationally, sometimes books on history that provide some sort of a perspective on the present, and then sometimes broader atmospheric or trend analysis books that help us to understand some broader developments that are taking place. Today's book is on domestic politics. Written by a man named López, and the title of the book is called Dog Whistle Politics: How Coded Racial Appeals Have Reinvented Racism and Wrecked the Middle Class. Now, joining me on the show today are two Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is Caro Theunisz, and to Caro's right is Lukas Walker. So I wanted to read an opening quote from the book so you can get a sense of where the author's coming from, and then we can jump into a discussion about this book. The author writes, "Some reading this book will be quick to retort that minorities vote overwhelmingly Democrat, implying that this asymmetry undercuts the argument that there is any great problem with the Republicans being identified almost exclusively with white voters. But the important questions are, first, why different racial groups vote as they do, and second, whether they are helped or harmed by doing so. Many minorities vote Democratic because they have been repelled by the Republicans and because of the fact that it's in their own economic interest. Many whites vote Republican out of racial anxiety, and as members of the middle class lose out when they do so."
What I took away from this is that many people do not see a problem with Republicans voting, or white people voting Republican and minorities voting Democratic. Most people just see it as a result from a cultural and historical events, but López is not satisfied with this explanation, and he really looks critically on how this division really emerged.
Yeah, I would just echo that as well. Voting habits obviously can emerge from a variety of reasons. Social class, your background, your location in America, what cities, states. So López really echoes this in his book. He talks about all the different reasons why people vote the way they do and what the two different parties have done to appeal to these people that they're trying to bring in to vote for them.
Yeah, there's a nice quote I like in the book. It's a little long, but I think because it includes quotes from former heads of the Republican Party, it gives you a sense that we're not just inventing what we're saying. It says, let's start with an open secret. Republicans rely on racial codes to help win elections. In 2010, the chairman of the Republican National Committee, Michael Steele, acknowledged that, quote, for the last 40 years, we had a Republican strategy, a Southern strategy that alienated many minority voters by focusing on the white male vote in the South, end of quote. Steele was echoing the remarks another head of the Republican National Committee, Ken Mehlman. In 2005, Mehlman used a speech before the NAACP to admit that his party had exploited racial divisions and had been wrong to do so. He said, by the 70s and into the 80s and 90s, Mehlman said from a prepared text, Republicans gave up on winning the African American vote, looking the other way or trying to benefit politically from racial polarization. I am here today as the Republican chairman to tell you we were wrong.
So it's one thing to say that they are wrong and to say that they will change it, but for Republicans to actually change the fact that they are mostly defined by race and supported by white people is almost impossible, since their whole party is based on the fact that they use race for their vote, use white people to get their votes.
Yeah, this book really opened my eyes to the way the two different parties campaign and how they code racism in their speeches and ads and such. And like they said in the Southern Strategy, I mean, they put a lot of effort and time and money into devoting, resources to win the Southern vote. They were really vetted in getting the white vote out of the South. So
Yeah, we'll come back to this Southern vote. It's more of a Southern strategy that he talks about in the book, and he means it broader than the South. But for example, in 2008, and then in 2012, so you're having Obama elected in 2008 and then reelected in 2012, so Republicans said there are just not enough middle-aged white guys out there that we can scrape them together to win. There's just not enough of them to win. And so here was another major figure in the Republican Party sort of realizing, so when we're looking back, I think I understand why Republicans are somewhat concerned with Trump. He won, but it was a very unusual way that he becomes president, with a bit more of the white vote, with a bit more of the turnout, with less of a turnout from minorities. So if you alter those a little and a few less white voters vote for a Republican and a few more minorities go to the polls, it's enough to constantly, seriously affect the Republicans' chances of winning.
Yeah, so it's actually really striking how much it matters that white people actually really vote for the Republicans. And the New York Times kind of mocked this concept by saying that there's just not enough middle-aged white men to vote for them. But it's actually made clear by another newspaper, The Nation, that it actually really does matter a lot, and that they state that if there were only white voters, that Romney would have carried every single state in America except for 4. So it really matters a lot, and to mock that concept is a little iffy.
Yeah, in the book it says that Romney won 59% of the white vote, so obviously he has the majority there, and that could be from a variety of reasons, from campaigning to just people actually interested. And he also carried the white women vote. He took that 56% to Obama's 42%. Now, where Republicans lack is in the minority base, and they can't appeal because they use coded racist slogans in their campaigns, so that kind of alienates some minorities.
Here's that second part of the title of the book says, "And wreck the middle class." And he makes a statement. He says, "Race constitutes this dark magic by which middle-class voters have been convinced to turn government over to the wildly affluent, notwithstanding the harm this does to themselves." And so he isn't just through the book trying to address how we see race used by either Democrats and Republicans, and he goes through sort of a history of it, looking at different campaigns and situations. But as a result, what he's trying to say that there's a significant harm to somebody that thinks they're white, and they don't quite grasp that they're hurting themselves. Obviously, in that sense, you might say he's trying to convince people to vote Democrat, but at the same time, I think he's also trying to maybe have Republicans make some changes in how they approach their suggestions and policy making.
Yeah, so the white middle class basically wrecks himself by voting Republican, because when what president is in the office really matters. It has a really big influence on the middle class, because when a Democrat is in office, the real incomes of the middle class has grown twice as fast and under the Republican. So if they vote for the Republican, they basically influencing themselves in a negative way.
Yeah, we see partisan politics play out in this as well. Democrats are obviously more for the people. They're going to be looking out to provide tax cuts and incentives for people to get back on their feet after recessions and such, while Republicans offer more tax cuts for corporations so that they can increase their profits. And what I found absolutely astounding in this book was López says the top 6 people in line to own Walmart own more wealth than 30% of the poorest people in America. So that was incredible to me to realize that perhaps per Republican policy that these people have accumulated so much wealth.
Yeah, when I see the issue of tax reform mentioned on television, it's always mentioned, but it's never dissected or explained. In other words, to say, okay, let's stop here and start just using the term tax reform. Stop for a minute and say, okay, let's put somebody's salary on the board who's making $35,000, $50,000, $75,000, $100,000. Show what a change in taxes, what you're saying precisely, because you're not just saying you're proposing to cut taxes, you're also at times saying you want to change the exemption so that you get an exemption for the interest on your mortgage, and you might get some educational or business exemption. So if those go away, what happens? And so they never say, I want to take a half an hour to explain this very well so you clearly understand at least what is before you. Instead, all you say is tax reform. And then you move on and you go, what did you say? I didn't quite grasp that.
Yeah, I think that's another thing, is they just kind of hint around what they actually mean. Don't dive too deep into what their policies will actually entail, so that people will, get on board because, oh, tax reform is a good thing, so we'll just assume because I like this candidate, he's going to do good things with tax reform.
I also think this is an example of coded language that happens a lot with the politicians. They don't explain too deeply about what's actually going on, and that's how they kind of trick people into voting for them.
He refers to Ronald Reagan, and Reagan used the term welfare queens, and then he also used the term strapping young bucks. And so he never mentioned race, but what the author's saying is, well, if you speak like this, it's sounded like you're talking about race or racism. Or he talked about Bill O'Reilly. So O'Reilly, Obama wins re-election in 2012, and O'Reilly says there are 50% of the voting public who want stuff. They want things, and who is going to give it to them? President Obama. He knows it, and he ran on it. 20 years ago, President Obama would have been roundly defeated by an established candidate like Mitt Romney. The white establishment is now the minority. And Romney himself said the Obama campaign was following the old playbook of giving a lot of stuff to groups that they hoped they could get to vote for them and be motivated to go out to the polls, especially the African American community, the Hispanic community, and young people.
Yeah, so the GOP basically represents himself or present themselves as non-racist because they don't explicitly mention race, but they use the coded language around it and then kind of touch on race anyway. And O'Reilly and Romney are a good example of that. And they make the white establishment, who is now a minority according to them, kind of the victims of the activist governments.
Yeah, and what O'Reilly really also said during this segment was that he basically cast white as victims in our government system, and that has just kind of flipped the rhetoric almost 180 from blacks, Hispanics, and Latinos being the minority to whites, because when parties promise all this free stuff to people, they're going to turn out and vote for the people they support.
Well, and I think the author's trying to show that that imagery isn't true, because he's trying to say, look, if I look at government programs and the money, that the majority of it is not going to anybody who's minority, it's going to white people. And so therefore that's why he's saying we look at the growth of a wealth gap, and that the rich are getting richer and sort of the poor are holding their own, so to speak, or the middle class is somehow losing ground, because he's saying a male worker in the middle class is losing ground. However, where middle class is sort of maintained, it was good that their wives entered the workforce, and by entering the workforce, then a middle class family is able to maintain itself. But a white male by itself is having problems, and it's not because of race, it's because of how you see policy changes.
Yeah, so you say it's not because of race, but it can be explained by dog whistle politics because the political structure of the United States shifts to the right because of dog whistle politics. So people vote for Republican parties more quickly when they are influenced by dog whistle politics, and that's how the middle class becomes more dependent on the Republican government, and then basically loses their own income.
He goes on, and he's got sections in the book dealing with specific politicians. And I was interested in the section on George Wallace. So Wallace used to be governor of Alabama, and so what ends up happening is he is going to lose his re-election bid. And what the chapter was talking about was that Wallace was originally considered a moderate Southerner, and he actually sat on the board of trustees of a prominent black enterprise educational institution, Tuskegee Institute, and he had the backing of the NAACP when he ran for governor. But then he loses, and now he refers to the idea, and there's a quote, he says, "Well, boys, we vowed no other son of a bitch will ever out and then end me again." And so now he shifted to realize he could use race as a way of running for office. So Wallace will shift and become sort of a very overt racist. And so then you end up having that picture of him standing in front of the University of Alabama, where he's trying to prevent black students from registering or entering the schoolhouse building, and it so made great theater. And there you see him standing there, and when the cameras are away, well, the students went to school there. But anyway, now he managed to do very good theater from a racial point of view. But he changed, and in this change, he managed to sought to introduce the idea of how you can use race to win elections.
Yeah, so basically by changing his perspective on race, he kind of grasped the attention of the population, and he started defending segregation, and he emphasized how proud he was to be from Anglo-Saxon origin. And at one point he was made fun of because how López says it, people saw him as a remorseless redneck. So this is the point when he changed his language and again made use of the dog whistle politics to cover up his racism a little bit, and instead of talking about the segregation, talked about federal authority and state rights. And that way he covered up his racism, and he changed his harsh language into a new vocabulary.
Yeah, I think it was actually kind of funny how he just kind of flip-flopped. Had the backing of the NAACP, and then all of a sudden had the backing from the Ku Klux Klan in his next run. So what he essentially did was just learn how to run and how to effectively win, and then that was all through a platform just based on race. So I think Wallace essentially almost invented dog whistle politics, because he kind of was really subtle, because he was the first person to bring up forced busing, so like busing students that should be going to like a black school to white schools, and like states' rights. He just kind of coded his language so that it didn't make it appear racist, but if you really like kind of delved into it, it would, you would figure it out.
Well, what was interesting in the Wallace situation and why it starts to grow outside the South is, okay, you have this television picture of Wallace standing right there and saying he's going to prevent black students from walking into the University of Alabama, but 2 hours later they did, so it was theater on television. But that he ended up receiving over 100,000 telegrams that supported what he did, and the book points out that more than half of them came from people outside the South, so that they were supporting what he was doing. And so it wasn't sort of just a Southern issue. And so then you have a quote that says, Wallace pioneered a kind of soft porn racism in which fear and hate could be mobilized without mentioning race, except to deny that one is a racist. And so as a result, he sort of said there and said, I stand for states' rights.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, he realized receiving all these telegrams the day after the Alabama incident, or University of Alabama incident, that he had support all over the nation. So he really kind of started to work with that and spread the use of this dog whistle, soft core porn racism model.
Then Nixon is borrowing, so Richard Nixon is borrowing George Wallace's idea, and he's applying it on a national basis when he runs for the presidency in 1968. And so that his emphasis on law and order was sort of a way of running against anybody who's a minority without actually saying the word race. And so then you sort of have this notion that what you're seeing is Nixon is sort of learning from Wallace.
Yeah, he really used the civil unrest to kind of get people to be on his side on the race issue. He kind of blamed black people for crime and the civil rights for becoming too violent for people. So he promised Americans that he would make them safe and make sure that no harm came to them.
Yeah, Nixon basically used the issue of law and order to draw the attention away from the issue of race and put it back on another cause, and basically take the morality of the activists away and put it in the white people again, because they are in favor of the law.
Barry Goldwater is going to run as the Republican presidential candidate in 1964 against Lyndon Johnson, but then a member of the Republican National Committee is sort of setting the tone, because in 63 he says, a good many, perhaps a majority of the party's leadership envisioning substantive political goal to be mined in the racial crisis by becoming fact, though not name, the white man's party. Remember, this isn't South Africa. The white man outnumbers the Negro 9-1 in this country. And so you were aware that, you know, how you're looking at voting and trying to get your hands on voters.
Yeah, so what was very striking for me is that before 1964, there was barely a difference between the two parties on supporting civil rights. And the moment that Nixon lost, the right-wing elements gained momentum, and he started emphasizing race way more.
Going back to Goldwater, because Nixon's 68, so 4 years earlier, Goldwater is running against New Deal programs that help the South. And so you're having the Tennessee Valley Authority that brings electricity for the first time to millions in the South. And Goldwater is running against that. He wants to sell that off, and he's highly critical of the New Deal programs that have been established back in the 1930s and helped a lot of people in the South and were very popular in the South. But here he is attacking the New Deal, and so this is where the author is raising up some issues about how you're voting against what's in your own best economic interest, and that as a result, racial anxiety seems to take precedence over something in your own economic interest.
Yeah, he found out that the key votes were in the South, and by getting those votes, this meant that he had to appeal on their racial sentiments in the white voter. And he also saw Democrats as a threat to the nation, so also the New Deal. They were in favor of a too powerful government, and he accused them of having connections with the Soviets.
Yeah, he really used coded language once again in his campaign to make sure that he took people's, attention off of important, helpful issues and programs and kind of turned it back on his own platform.
Yeah, and so he said, the author writes, he convinced many Southern voters to vote Republican for the first time ever. And the reason I say that is because Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. So it was Abraham Lincoln that, if you're a white Southerner, you'd say, hey, he freed the slaves. So now, as a result, you wouldn't be voting Republican. You'd always vote Democrat. So the author writes, he convinced many Southern voters to vote Republican for the first time ever, and in the Deep South, comprised of those 5 states with the highest black populations, Goldwater won outright. The anti-New Deal Republican carried Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and South Carolina, states in which whites had never voted for a Republican president in more than the smallest of numbers. This was a shocking transformation.
Yeah, and the party switching like that really was. Nobody really expected it to happen. But once you can appeal to people's, I guess, racism within them, then they'll vote for you.
We only have a few minutes left, so what do you think of this book, and do you recommend it to people watching this show?
I think it was a very tough read. Once you get a hang of it, it is very useful because it really changes your perspective on racism and how it actually interferes with the middle class and how much influence it has on daily politics.
Yeah, this book really opened my eyes to the coded languages. I hadn't really realized it myself on how many people, when it started, just the whole background of it really. It does take a little bit longer to read, so give yourself some time and really just kind of go through it slowly, make sure you're really understanding it. But yes, I would recommend it.
Yeah, I think it's a good book. I think it gave me more of an insight into how you saw race sort of become and still be used. His second half of the title, Wreck the Middle Class, he's sort of said, well, it happened because of the fact that the Republicans attacked government, and in that process, so he sort of makes a leap of faith, and I wish he would have gone into more depth about saying, okay, what precisely, because Republicans don't like this, how precisely did it hurt the middle class? He sort of talks about it, but it's not really well developed. He's saying, yeah, government benefits tend to benefit more whites than blacks or minorities. And then he goes into it in a little detail, but he doesn't really develop that well. So, but I would say, you know, the gist of the book being that race is used in politics, and you can't escape that. We end up seeing it used all the time, is insightful. I just wanted that particular part developed a little bit more. So thank you for joining us. It's a good book, very readable. You can get through it. Thank you for joining us today.